The diplomatic shuttle Harmony's edge wasn't supposed to slam into the side of a building. It definitely wasn't supposed to be the nursery wing of the most important alien facility in 3 sectors. But here we were, smoke pouring from our engines, alarms shrieking in at least 4 different languages, and what sounded like 1,000 dying air conditioners wailing from somewhere beyond the twisted metal. "Well," said Captain Morrison, unbuckling her harness with the kind of calm that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. That wasn't in the briefing. The impact had thrown them all forward against their restraints. Engineer Patricia was bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Medic Thompson was checking his equipment for damage, and Communications Officer Riley was trying to make sense of the cacophony of alien voices now flooding their comm system. "Captain," Riley said, pressing one hand to her earpiece, "I'm getting about 50 different emergency frequencies, and none of them sound happy." Through the jagged hole their shuttle had torn in what looked like a crystalline wall. The wailing continued. It was the kind of sound that made your teeth ache and your soul want to file a complaint with the universe's customer service department. The Corvani officials who came running looked like 7-foot-tall wolves wearing business suits and expressions of pure horror. Their leader, whose translator badge read Administrative Pack Leader Kethvar, kept making a noise that sounded like a garbage disposal eating gravel while having an existential crisis. "You have contaminated the sacred nursery." Kethvar's ears were flat against his skull, and his voice carried the kind of panic usually reserved for natural disasters. "The Cubs have not ceased their distress calls since your vessel breached the Harmony chamber." More Corvani were arriving by the minute, all of them making variations of the same distressed sounds. Some were wearing what looked like hazmat suits. Others carried equipment that was probably either medical or military. It was hard to tell with alien tech. "Okay, so," Engineer Patricia wiped coolant off her hands, leaving a streak of blue across her palm. "How bad are we talking here? Scale of 1 to diplomatic incident?" "The Cubs cry without end," another Corvani official said, his voice cracking like ice under pressure. 18 hours now. The pack elders cannot sleep. The harmony is broken. The young ones' life songs grow weak. Captain Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the environmental systems. "Weak how?" "They will die if this continues," Kethvar said, as if the words tasted like poison. "Corvani young cannot survive prolonged distress. Their hormone systems cascade into failure. You have doomed an entire generation." Through the breach, the crying seemed to intensify, as if the Cubs could sense the growing desperation of the adults around them. Morrison could see movement in the shadows, beyond the hole. Small shapes in what looked like glowing pods, all of them producing that heartbreaking wail. "How many?" Thompson asked quietly, his medical scanner already in his hands. 43 Cubs, Kethvar replied. "The youngest barely 3 cycles old. The oldest not yet ready for first hunt. All of them. All of them crying for their pack mothers who can no longer comfort them." Patricia looked at the captain. The captain looked at Thompson. Thompson looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else in the galaxy, preferably somewhere with fewer dying alien babies. "Right," Morrison said, standing up and brushing debris off her uniform. "So we fix it." "Fix it?" Kethvar's laugh sounded like breaking glass mixed with grinding metal. "You are mammals. Primitive. You know nothing of Corvani young care protocols. Your very presence disrupts the harmony frequency. We must quarantine you immediately before you cause further contamination." "Contamination?" Patricia raised an eyebrow, wincing as the movement pulled at her cut. "Look, Furry, we're not radioactive. We just had a bad landing." "Your presence disrupts the harmony frequency," another official explained, backing away from the humans as if they might suddenly sprout fangs and start howling. "The Cubs sense alien pheromones, predator scent, fear markers. They know danger is near and cannot be comforted while you remain." Riley was monitoring the comm channels, her face growing increasingly pale. "Captain, I'm picking up transmissions from at least 6 other Corvani facilities. They're all reporting similar distress calls from their nurseries. Whatever we did here, it's spreading." "Spreading how?" Morrison demanded. "The Harmony Network," Kethvar said, his voice barely above a whisper. All nurseries are connected. When one fails, the others sense it. The cubs across the entire colony world are beginning to cry. Soon, it will reach the orbital stations. Then, the other worlds. A new sound cut through the wailing. Lower. More desperate. More final. Thompson, who'd been quietly scanning through the breach with his medical equipment, went pale. "Captain," he said quietly, "their stress hormones are spiking beyond anything I've seen. Whatever this cascade thing is, it's accelerating. And it's not just the cubs anymore. The adult Corvani are showing signs of severe psychological distress." The Corvani officials made that garbage disposal noise again, but louder and more desperate. More of them were arriving now, all looking like they wanted to either flee or attack. Some were openly weeping, a sight that was somehow more disturbing than anything else that had happened. "The pack bonds," Elder Vethara said, appearing from behind the crowd of officials. She was ancient even by Corvani standards, her fur more white than gray, her eyes clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence. "When the young cry, the pack suffers. When the pack suffers, the young cry, harder. It is a cycle that has no end once begun." "How long do we have?" Morrison asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Thompson checked his readings, cross-referencing with the alien physiological data their diplomatic package had provided. "At this rate, maybe 6 hours before we start seeing organ failure in the youngest ones. 12 hours before the psychological stress starts causing permanent damage to the adults." The wailing from the nursery changed pitch again, became somehow more heartbreaking, more desperate. Even the hardened Corvani officials were starting to look physically ill, their ears pressed flat against their skulls, their eyes wide with a kind of primal terror. "This is unprecedented," Kethavar whispered, his voice breaking. "Never in our history have the cubs rejected the harmony for so long. Never have so many young cried at once. Your species has brought catastrophe to our world." Morrison looked at the hole in the wall, then at her crew, then at the increasingly panicked aliens surrounding them. Through the breach, she could see the soft glow of the nursery pods, each one containing a small life that was slowly fading because of their accident. "Well," she said, straightening her shoulders with the kind of determination that had gotten her through 3 wars and a diplomatic career, "I guess we better figure out how to sing a lullaby." Riley looked up from her comm station, her face grim. "Captain, that might not be our biggest problem anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean our emergency beacon has been broadcasting this whole time. Every word we've said, every sound from the nursery, it's all been transmitted to the Galactic Council monitoring station." Morrison felt her stomach drop. "And they've just declared a Code Amber situation. First contact protocols are now in effect, and they're sending a full diplomatic investigation team." Patricia wiped more blood from her forehead and grinned with the kind of humor that usually preceded very bad decisions. "Well, Captain, looks like we're about to make galactic history." And that's when someone pressed the wrong button. The wrong button, as it turned out, belonged to Engineer Patricia, who had been trying to shut off the shuttle's emergency beacon and instead triggered the hull breach containment system. Which meant the shuttle was now hermetically sealed to the nursery wall, with molecular bonding clamps designed to hold during core breaches. "Oops," Patricia said, staring at the control panel as if it had personally betrayed her. That's not coming off anytime soon." "Define not soon," Captain Morrison said, in the tone of voice that suggested Patricia's next performance review might be conducted from the brig. "Like, maybe never? Those clamps are designed to hold during warp core explosions. We're basically part of their building now. Structurally speaking, we just became the galaxy's most expensive, permanent installation." Through the breach, the crying continued with the kind of relentless intensity that made everyone in the area look like they were developing migraines. The Corvani officials were huddled together in what could only be described as a furry pile of despair, making distressed whimpering sounds that their translators couldn't seem to process. "Wonderful," Morrison muttered. "Riley, what's our communication status?" "Still broadcasting everything to half the galaxy, Captain. The Galactic Council monitoring station is requesting hourly updates, and I'm getting priority message requests from at least 12 different species." "Oh, And someone from the Terran Diplomatic Corps is asking if we need a lawyer. Probably, Thompson said, checking his medical readings again. Captain, the Cubs' distress levels are still climbing. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it soon. Right, Morrison said, looking at the breach that was now permanently connecting their shuttle to an alien nursery. New plan. We go in there and fix this ourselves. Captain! Kethvar's voice was barely above a whisper, and he was backing away from the humans as if they'd announced plans to juggle antimatter. You cannot. The contamination protocols clearly state that alien presence in the nursery will only increase the distress. The Cubs are dying faster with us out here than they would with us in there. Morrison was already climbing through the breach, her boots crunching on crystalline debris. Thompson, Patricia, Riley, with me. Let's go meet some babies. The nursery was nothing like what any of them had expected. Instead of cribs or beds, there were what looked like soft, glowing pods arranged in perfect geometric patterns across a vast chamber. The walls were covered in what appeared to be living crystal formations that pulsed with gentle light, or had been pulsing gently before their arrival. Now the crystals were flickering erratically, their harmony disrupted. Each pod held a small, furry creature that looked like a cross between a wolf pup and a teddy bear, designed by someone with a very generous definition of adorable. And every single one of them was crying with the kind of desperate intensity that made your heart want to break and your ears want to file for asylum. Sweet, merciful void, Patricia whispered, her usual sarcasm completely absent. They're so small. The Cubs were maybe the size of house cats, with oversized ears and eyes that seemed too big for their faces. Their fur was a soft silver gray that seemed to shimmer in the pod light, and they were all reaching toward the humans with tiny clawed hands that looked like they'd never heard anything in their short lives. The harmony generators, Thompson said, pointing to several large, obviously broken devices scattered around the room like the remnants of some technological disaster. Sparks were still flying from a few of them, and the air smelled of ozone and burned electronics. Our crash must have destroyed them. What do they do? Morrison asked, moving carefully between the pods. Several Cubs tracked her movement, their crying shifting in pitch as she passed. A new Corvani voice answered from behind them, older and more gravelly than the officials they'd met. They sing the song of the pack. The Cubs know they are safe when they hear it. They know they are loved. They turned to see an ancient-looking Corvani female, her fur more white than gray, her eyes clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence. Unlike the officials outside, she didn't seem afraid of the humans, just tired and infinitely sad. I am Elder Vethara, she said, moving slowly into the nursery with the careful grace of someone who had seen too many years and too much sorrow. These are my great-grandcubs. They have never known silence like this. They think the pack has abandoned them to die alone. Can't you sing to them yourselves? Riley asked, her communications equipment picking up the subtle harmonics in the elder's voice. We have tried. For 18 hours, we have tried. Vethara moved slowly toward one of the pods, where a particularly small cub was reaching for her with both tiny paws. But we are too distressed. Our harmony is broken by fear and anger and grief. The Cubs sense our emotions through the pack bond and cry harder. They need the peace song, the safe song. We no longer remember how to sing it. Morrison watched the Cubs reaching toward them with those tiny hands. One of them, slightly larger than the rest and with distinctive golden markings around its eyes, had stopped crying just long enough to stare at her with enormous amber eyes that seemed to hold far too much intelligence for something so young. What if, she said slowly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. What if we tried? You? Kethvar had followed them into the nursery, along with several other officials who were maintaining what they probably thought was a safe distance. You are not pack. You cannot sing the harmony. You do not know the ancient songs of comfort and safety. Maybe not your harmony, Morrison said, moving closer to the large cub's pod. The little creature's crying softened slightly, as if it was curious about this strange new presence that smelled different from everything it had ever known. But we've got our own. She looked at her crew, all of whom were staring at the crying cubs with expressions of growing determination, mixed with the kind of desperate hope that came from having no other options. "Patricia," Morrison said, "remember that song from basic training? The one everyone sang during the long hauls between systems?" Patricia's eyes lit up with understanding, though she still looked skeptical. "You mean Starlight Serenade? Captain, that's just a stupid drinking song we made up during a 3-month patrol. It doesn't mean anything." "It's a song," Morrison said, reaching toward the large cub's pod. "And right now, that's all we've got." The cub reached back, its tiny claws barely brushing her fingers through the pod's energy barrier. The moment they made contact, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Morrison began to hum, low and soft. The tune was simple, something humans had been singing on ships for decades during the lonely stretches between stars. Nothing special, nothing magical, just a melody that said, "You're not alone. Someone is here. Someone cares." The large cub stopped crying. Complete silence fell over the nursery for exactly 3 seconds. Then every Corvani in the room made a sound like a steam engine having an argument with a tornado. "It worked," Thompson whispered, his medical scanner showing the cub's stress hormones dropping for the first time in 18 hours. "Holy shit, it actually worked." The other cubs were still crying, but they were watching now, their attention focused on Morrison and the strange new sound she was making. Several of them had stopped reaching desperately, and were instead listening with the kind of intense concentration that suggested something important was happening. Morrison continued humming, adding words in a soft, gentle voice. "Far from home but not alone, sailing through the starlit foam, every light a friendly face, every star a warm embrace." More cubs began to quiet, their crying shifting to softer whimpers, and then to an almost inquisitive silence. "Impossible," Kethavar breathed. "The harmony frequency is completely wrong. The tonal structure bears no resemblance to proper pack songs. This should not work." But it was working. One by one, the cubs were settling into their pods, their tiny faces turned toward the humans with expressions of growing calm. Morrison finished the first verse and looked at her crew. "Well? Are you going to leave me singing solo here?" Patricia grinned and joined in with a harmony line. Then Riley added her voice, and finally Thompson, who couldn't carry a tune in a bucket but tried anyway. The song wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly good. But it was human, and it was offered with genuine care. And somehow that seemed to be enough. The last cub stopped crying just as Morrison reached the final line. "Sleep now, child. The journey's long, but you'll wake up safe and strong." The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in 18 hours, the nursery was at peace. But that wasn't even the worst mistake they'd made yet. The worst mistake, it turned out, was stopping the song. The moment Morrison's voice faded into silence, every cub in the nursery resumed wailing with renewed intensity. But this time was different. This time, there was something in their cries that made every Corvani in the room step backward with expressions of genuine terror. "What did you do?" Kethavar's voice was barely controlled panic, his ears flat against his skull and his tail bristled, to twice its normal size. "What did you do to them?" "I sang a song," Morrison protested, reaching toward the large cub's pod again. The moment her hand approached, the cub's crying shifted to something that sounded almost like calling. "That's it. Just a song." "They are calling for you," Elder Vethara said, her ancient voice filled with something between wonder and horror. "They are calling for the new pack voice. They have bonded to your harmony." The implications of this statement hit the room like a physical force. Several Corvani officials made choking sounds. One of them actually sat down hard on the floor as if his legs had given out. Thompson was scanning the cubs frantically with his medical equipment, his face growing pale as he read the results. "Captain, their stress hormones just spiked again, but it's different this time. It's not just general distress. It's like separation anxiety. They're crying for you specifically." As if to prove his point, the large cub Morrison had first approached was now standing in its pod, tiny claws gripping the edge, staring directly at her while producing the most heartbreaking sound any of them had ever heard. Other cubs were doing the same, all of them reaching toward the humans with desperate urgency. "This is impossible," Kethvar said, his voice cracking. "Cubs bond only to pack, only to Corvani. You are alien. You are other. You are not even the same evolutionary tree." "Well, apparently we're other enough," Patricia said, though her usual sarcasm was tempered by the sight of dozens of baby aliens crying specifically for human attention. "Captain, I think you just accidentally adopted about 50 alien babies." Riley's communication equipment was going crazy, lights flashing and alarms beeping as priority messages flooded in from across the galaxy. "Captain, the emergency broadcast is still active. Everyone's hearing this, and I mean everyone." More Corvani were arriving now, streaming through the nursery entrance in growing numbers. These ones looked different, older, more decorated, with the kind of presence that suggested they made important decisions and weren't used to having those decisions questioned by reality. Their leader was massive even by Corvani standards, with elaborate markings that probably indicated high rank. "Pack Leader Kethvar," the newcomer rumbled, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made junior officers everywhere instinctively stand straighter. "Explain this contamination." "High Alpha Zarketh." Kethvar practically prostrated himself, his whole body language screaming submission and terror. "The aliens have somehow corrupted our cubs. They respond only to the mammal song now. The pack bond has been altered." High Alpha Zarketh looked at the humans the way someone might look at a particularly unpleasant species of insect that had somehow learned to talk, and was now making unreasonable demands about property rights. "Remove them," he said, his voice carrying the finality of an avalanche. "Immediately." "We tried that," Elder Vethara said quietly, her aged voice somehow carrying more weight than all the official bluster. "The cubs' distress increases when the humans move away. Their hormone levels become dangerous." As if summoned by her words, a new group of Corvani entered the nursery. These wore the kind of equipment that screamed scientist in any language, all scanners and sensors, and the particular brand of organized chaos that came with emergency research. Their leader, a sleek female with intricate spiral markings covering her arms, was carrying what looked like a scanner advanced enough to probably violate several laws of physics. "High Alpha," she said, her voice crisp with professional efficiency. "I am Research Pack Leader Nixandra. We have been monitoring the situation from the moment the contamination began. The cubs have formed an unprecedented cross-species attachment bond. Their neurochemistry has adapted to recognize human vocal frequencies as pack safety signals." "That's impossible," Zarketh growled, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was beginning to suspect that impossibility was rapidly becoming irrelevant. "Nevertheless, it has occurred." Nixandra's scanner was beeping frantically, displaying readouts that made several of the other scientists make excited chittering sounds. "More concerning, the bond appears to be mutual. The humans are exhibiting elevated oxytocin and protective hormone responses. They have, in essence, adopted our cubs as their own young." Morrison felt a strange tightness in her chest as she looked at the crying cubs, all of them reaching for her and her crew with desperate need. "That's ridiculous. We just met them. We don't even know what they eat." "And yet," Nixandra said, her scanner now focused on Morrison herself, "you are prepared to remain here, in potential danger from hostile aliens, to comfort young that are not your responsibility, not your species, not even your biological classification. Your species appears to possess an unprecedented capacity for cross-species parental bonding." "It's not parental," Patricia protested, though she was unconsciously moving closer to a pod containing a particularly small cub that kept reaching for her specifically. "It's just... they're babies. They're scared. Of course we want to help them." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Every Corvani in the room was staring at the humans with expressions ranging from shock to something that might have been existential terror. "Of course," Zarketh repeated slowly, as if the words were in a language he'd never heard before. "You would risk yourselves for young that are not your pack? Not your species? Not your evolutionary line?" "Well, yeah," Morrison said, genuinely confused by their reaction. "Wouldn't you?" Another silence. Longer this time. More profound. "No," Elder Vethara said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. No, we would not. That is not how pack bonds work. You care for your own. You protect your own. Others are others. To risk yourself for alien young would be madness. Riley looked up from her communication station, her face pale. Captain, I'm getting priority messages from the Galactic Council. They want to know if what they're hearing is accurate. What exactly are they hearing? Morrison asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know. Everything. The whole conversation. And they're not the only ones. I've got incoming messages from the Centauri Federation, the Vegan Trade Alliance, the Crystalline Collective. Captain, half the galaxy is listening to this. The cubs were still crying, but some of them had started making a different sound when they looked at the humans, almost like purring. It was a sound that seemed to bypass rational thought and go straight to some deep, evolutionary part of the human brain that said, protect this, care for this is precious. Hi, Alpha, Nixandra said, her voice carefully neutral, but her scanner readings clearly visible to everyone in the room. We have a problem. The cubs will not survive without the human presence. But the humans cannot remain here indefinitely. Their own species will expect them to return. Why not? Morrison asked, the words coming out before she could stop them. Every Corvani in the room turned to stare at her with expressions of complete incomprehension. I mean, she continued, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff but unable to stop herself. If they need us, we stay. Right? That's how this works? You don't abandon children who need you. High Alpha Zarketh made a sound like a landslide having an argument with a tornado while suffering from severe indigestion. You would abandon your own mission? Your own people? Your own species' interests? For alien young that have no connection to you whatsoever? Morrison looked around the nursery at the dozens of small, desperate faces all turned toward her and her crew. At the cubs who had stopped crying only when humans sang to them. At the tiny creatures who were apparently going to die if she and her team left. They're not alien young, she said, moving closer to the large cub's pod. The little creature immediately reached for her with both paws, making soft sounds that tugged at something deep in her chest. They're just young. The cub's tiny claws brushed against her fingers through the energy barrier, and without thinking, she reached back, making contact. What happened next made galactic history, started 3 different research programs, and caused the Galactic Council to create an entirely new classification for species that were too dangerous to ignore and too useful to eliminate. What happened next was that the moment Morrison's finger touched the cub's paw, every single baby in the nursery stopped crying at exactly the same time. The silence was so sudden and complete that several Corvani officials actually stumbled backward, as if the absence of sound was a physical force. Then, very quietly, the cubs began to purr. Sweet, merciful void, Elder Vethara whispered, her ancient voice filled with awe. They have accepted her as pack mother. The large cub Morrison was touching had wrapped both tiny paws around her finger and was making a sound like a tiny engine running on pure contentment. Around the room, other cubs were settling into their pods, finally relaxed. This is unprecedented, Nixandra said, her scanner producing sounds that suggested it was either having a breakdown or achieving enlightenment. Cross-species pack adoption has never been documented in galactic history. The implications, High Alpha Zarketh interrupted, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, are that these humans have somehow corrupted our young through unknown psychological manipulation techniques. Or, Patricia said, gently stroking a cub's pod, maybe your kids just like us better because we're not having a collective nervous breakdown every time something unexpected happens. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Zarketh's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that could probably bite through hull plating. Hi, Alpha! A new voice interrupted, sharp with urgency. This one came from a Corvani wearing advanced communications equipment. Urgent priority message from the Galactic Council emergency session. They are aware of the situation. Aware how? Morrison asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. The emergency beacon from your shuttle has been broadcasting this entire time, the communications officer said, his voice shaking. Every word, every sound. Representatives from 14 species have convened emergency sessions to discuss human capabilities. Riley's equipment was practically screaming with incoming messages. Captain, I've got priority communications from species I've never even heard of. The hive queens want to know if we can calm their larvae. The Silicon Collective is asking about our emotional manipulation technologies. Thompson looked up from his scanner, his expression grim. Captain, we might have a problem. A big one. Bigger than accidentally adopting 50 alien babies? Yeah, much bigger. Thompson's medical readings made him look like he'd rather be facing down a plague outbreak. According to these readings, what just happened here isn't just about the cubs. It's about us. Humans, I mean. We're apparently capable of forming parental bonds with any species that exhibits juvenile characteristics. Any species. So? Patricia asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to grasp the implications. So, Nixandra said quietly, there are over 300 known sapient species in the galaxy. Most of them have young. And if humans can bond with any of them, can inspire protective instincts across species barriers. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. They think we're going to adopt the entire galaxy, Morrison said. Worse, Zarketh growled, his earlier anger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. They think you're going to make the entire galaxy adopt you. A species that can inspire protective instincts across genetic barriers is either the greatest diplomatic asset ever discovered, or the most dangerous predator imaginable. The communication officer's equipment was chirping frantically. High Alpha, incoming priority communications from the Centauri Federation, the Vegan Trade Alliance, the Crystalline Collective, and, oh void preserve us, the Hive Queens are requesting immediate audience. The Hive Queens? Morrison asked. They want to know, the officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. If humans can calm their larvae during molting season. Apparently, they lose thousands of young every cycle to stress-induced complications. Riley was staring at her readouts with the expression of someone watching a disaster unfold. Captain, I'm getting similar requests from, well, everyone. The machine consciousness is asking if we can form emotional bonds with artificial intelligences. And there's a message here from something called the Elder Council that just says, we need to talk. Morrison looked around the nursery, at the peaceful cubs who had bonded to her crew, at the Corvani officials staring at the humans with mixtures of awe, terror, and calculation. Well, she said, gently disengaging her finger from the large cub's grip. This should be interesting. 6 months later, Captain Morrison stood in what used to be a diplomatic meeting room, and was now essentially the galaxy's most expensive daycare center. Around her, representatives from 12 different species were monitoring their young as they played with human caregivers. The original Corvani cubs had grown considerably, and were now teaching Centauri hatchlings how to properly pounce on Engineer Patricia, who was pretending to be defeated by creatures the size of house cats. Thompson was reading stories to sentient crystals that chimed in harmony. Riley had become the galaxy's first interspecies communications specialist. Status report, Captain, Admiral Chen called from Earth Command with weary resignation. Well, Morrison said, watching a vegan tadpole thing try to braid her hair while a small Corvani cub supervised. The good news is, we've prevented 17 potential wars by providing childcare services. Turns out most interstellar conflicts start because nobody wants to risk their children. And we've become the neutral party everyone trusts. And the bad news? Morrison looked around the room, at the dozens of alien young who considered humans to be their secondary family, at the parents who dropped their kids off with bewildered gratitude, at her crew, who had become the galaxy's most in-demand babysitters. The bad news is we're never going home. The Galactic Council has officially classified humans as a nurture-class species and assigned us permanent childcare duties. Later that night, Morrison found herself in the original nursery with the large Corvani cub, now nearly adult-sized but still her shadow. He was curled up beside her chair, occasionally purring. Any regrets? Elder Vethara asked, settling down beside them. Morrison considered this. 6 months ago, she'd been a simple diplomatic courier. Now she was the galaxy's unofficial minister of interspecies childcare. From somewhere in the facility, she could hear Patricia singing a lullaby to hive queen larvae. The song was in 3 different languages, completely off-key, and included technical specifications for warp drives. The babies seemed to love it anyway. "Ask me again in 20 years, Morrison said, scratching behind the cub's ears. "When we figure out whether we've saved the galaxy or accidentally conquered it through superior babysitting." In his final classified report, Galactic Council Observer Kexthal wrote, "Recommendation: never underestimate a species that will sing to calm the young of others. They are either the most benevolent creatures in the galaxy, or the most terrifying predators we have ever encountered. Possibly both. The humans have demonstrated an ability to form parental bonds across any species barrier, inspiring protective instincts in beings that should view them as threats. This has prevented multiple conflicts and created unprecedented cooperation. However, it has also made them indispensable to the point where refusing their presence could be considered aggression. Further observation required, but from a safe distance. Also, request immediate transfer to a sector without humans. My own young have started asking when the nice singing mammals are coming to visit, and I find myself disturbingly inclined to arrange it." The report was filed under Humanity. Approach with caution and adequate childproofing. A handwritten note was attached. "We should never have let humans in the room. Now we can't get them to leave, and we don't want them to."